Less than 24 hours had passed. Brian Hooker had barely walked out of police station in the Bahamas and he was already giving interviews. He swore in front of the cameras that he would never hurt his wife. According to him, Lynette is his whole life and he has no plans to stop searching for her. Am I going to keep looking for her? Well, somebody with a whole lot more authority is going to have to come tell me to stop.
He said the wind separated them with such sudden force that he believes she tried to swim back to the sailboat to their own vessel, which was at a distance of, maybe 1,000 yards or so. According to him, the waves were 3 feet high. He was trying to secure the oars when one of the pins broke and the oar fell into the water. He says he didn't stop yelling her name for a single second. However, Lynette's own daughter doesn't quite believe the version Brian gave her. There are things that just don't add up. Why would she be swimming in the opposite direction of the boat, and why on earth did she have the keys on her? Her friends are also suspicious. The messages he was sending me told a very different story from the one the media was putting out at the time. You know how it goes. The news reported that she had fallen into the sea, and that he simply watched the current carry her out toward the open ocean. But if the current was so powerful that it dragged her away, why didn't it move the dinghy in that same direction? It's absurd. That voice belongs to Dr. Laura Petler, a forensic criminologist who specializes in detecting crime scenes that have been staged or manipulated. She's clear about one thing: investigating a possible crime scene in the water is infinitely more complicated and murkier than doing it on dry land. Don't forget to like and subscribe, so you stay up to date on every development in this incredibly strange investigation. For now, Brian Hooker is not facing any criminal charges, but the shadow of suspicion is heavy and follows him everywhere. What really happened to Lynette Hooker? Let's dig into the details. Dr. Laura Petler, it's a real honor to have you here. Thank you for joining us. On the contrary, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back to break this down. We have a chilling case about an American woman who vanished in the waters of the Bahamas, Lynette Hooker. And I have to tell you, Laura, that I thought of you immediately while I was going through the files. All of this fits perfectly with your brilliant track record analyzing the criminal mind and the validity of the facts. So, Laura, what was the first thing that crossed your mind when you heard the account of Lynette going overboard and disappearing? Always according to her husband's version. While the drama was just beginning to come to light, as soon as I read the story and what he allegedly told the Bahamian police, my brain made an immediate connection. I thought, she's gone, he's rowing. The big problem with that sequence of events is everything that's not being said, all those gaps in the narrative that are crucial. For me, it wasn't relevant what he said, but rather what he chose to leave out when trying to explain a tragedy of this magnitude. Of course, I took everything with a grain of salt. Press reports about people's statements aren't always 100% accurate. Sometimes there's a huge gap between what someone says in an interrogation and what journalists manage to report. It's a factor I always have to consider before drawing any conclusion. But with my background in domestic violence cases and intimate partner homicides, this case hit me differently. I knew I had to give it my full attention. I have no doubt that's how it was. I knew it. It's just that Laura, as this unfolds, the idea that she simply fell out of that little boat. And to be clear, we're not over-speculating, because legally there are no charges against him yet, right? The tragic part is that Lynette hasn't turned up. There's no trace of her, dead or alive. We haven't been able to locate Lynette Hooker anywhere. Key pieces of this puzzle are missing. But for you, what stands out the most? You mentioned that there were specific words at the start that set off your alarm bells. What do those words tell you on a professional level? The first thing that jumped out at me was that he rowed back to shore, but the way the event is described, it's strange. I think most people would have reacted instinctively. They would have jumped in the water without thinking twice. They would have gone after her, risked their lives, let themselves be carried by the current rather than let her go. We come back to the same thing. If the current took her, why wasn't the boat dragged to the same place? Why would they go in different directions, him one way and her another? It doesn't make physical sense. If the motor is off, the moment she falls, propulsion disappears. It's cut off. There's no driving force anymore, so everything is left to the laws of physics. It's that simple. It all comes down to physics. You get it. She's at the mercy of the physics of the water. He's also at the mercy of that same physics, but he has an oar. He's rowing against the current. So the million-dollar question is, why would he row away from her instead of going straight to her rescue? Well, you know there are different versions. Some say the wind blew in such a way that it separated them violently, right? That's the version he gave. The officers, a gust separated them violently. Not only that, he also sent some messages to an old friend, Daniel Danforth, who I spoke with just last night. His account was straightforward. They went out to sea in heavy waves, and Lynette ended up going overboard. He painted it for me in a strange way, as if she was just out there somewhere far off. Like he was saying, "You're over there, and I ended up here." The current would have carried him to a different island. According to him, she was swimming when they lost track of each other, but the texts tell a different story. She was heading to the sailboat. In his mind, she would reach the boat without any problem, while he simply drifted away with no direction. But the pieces don't fit. What you're about to hear is a private call between Brian Hooker and Blaine Stevenson that was recorded. Brian had no idea anyone was capturing his words as he recounted what happened the night Lynette vanished. "The wind hit us with such force that it separated us instantly. I guess she tried to swim back to the sailboat, our own boat. We must have been about, I don't know, maybe 1,000 yards apart roughly. With waves about 3 feet high, I tried to maneuver the oars, but one of the supports just snapped. The oar went to the bottom, and I kept yelling her name desperate in the dark. I shouted to let her know I'd lost an oar. After that, I dropped the anchor to try to stabilize the dinghy. I yelled again and threw her one of those floating cushions we used as seats, right when she fell in the water. I have no idea if she managed to grab it. After an hour shouting her name into the void, I never heard her voice again. At that moment, a speedboat went by, and I waved my cell phone flashlight to get their attention. They were going so fast they didn't even notice me. 5 minutes later, another vessel appeared. By then, I had already pulled out the flares. I lit the 2 I had, but that didn't work either. They didn't see them. The more they talk, the more material they give me. Every word is a new piece we add to our criminal analysis matrix. We pull it all apart, piece by piece, word by word. When you dissect a statement like this, the cracks usually jump right out. First, there's the initial report to the Bahamian police, or maybe what he said at the boatyard after coming out of the brush. Then we have the text messages and all those communications he had with third parties. I also understand that he didn't get in touch with her daughter until late at night. That's where a third version of the events emerges, right when he finally talks to her. We log every detail in our spreadsheet. Absolutely everything goes through the same rigorous filter of analysis. When you compare the data, that spreadsheet starts to reveal inconsistencies in every part of the story. The pieces just don't fit. Normally, when someone remembers a real event, they tell it following a logical timeline, step by step. However, in specific cases of intimate partner crimes, I've noticed something disturbing. There's always a gap, an inexplicable blank. There's a huge silence, an abyss of silence right at the moment she disappears. It's almost like a neurological short circuit. Suddenly, the suspect can't recall a single key detail. It happens more often than you'd think. And honestly, the more this man talks, the more tools he hands over to the Bahamian authorities. With every word, the police can compare his versions and with some luck unravel what really happened out there at sea. The problem, of course, is that there's no body. Legally, they still can't prove she's dead. Let's talk about the history of violence. Have you had access to those reports of past abuse? Yes, and it's alarming. According to my records, that pattern of abuse stretched from 2005 to 2015. We're talking about a relationship that lasted decades. They were married for over 21 years, a whole lifetime. We know they had a serious altercation in January of 2024, although it seems they patched things up almost immediately. However, by February of that same year, 2024, she was already sensing that the relationship had no future. "I shouldn't even be on this boat with him," was what she hinted at in one of her last text messages. What do I make of this? Simple. The best way to predict how someone will act tomorrow is to look at what they did yesterday. That's why I look for behavioral patterns. And in domestic violence cases, those patterns are usually astonishingly clear-cut, almost textbook. It's not subtle or some strange behavior that's hard to identify under the surface of the story. They're usually obvious. The big obstacle with intimate partner violence is that by its very nature, it tends to stay hidden in the shadows. It's a horror that happens in the vast majority of cases behind closed doors. We're dealing with a case of behind closed doors violence. It's hard to grasp what someone is going through when there are no witnesses. At the end of the day, the only ones who see the truth are the two people in that private tragedy. If we trace their history, the documented record goes all the way back to 2005. There was an incident in 2015. Although 2 isolated episodes aren't enough to establish a trend, Not yet. To talk about a real pattern, you'd need to see more incidents over time. You have to map, measure, and confirm that conduct. It's like with bloodstains, a few drops don't tell you anything, just like a couple of fights don't define a dynamic. A pattern has to be just that repetitive, over and over and over again. That's why we have to be cautious. We can't label this as systematic violence based on these isolated events alone. But what you can perceive is a constant instability that ran through the entire relationship. There are couples, of course, who never go through anything like this in their entire life together. However, when you analyze the reports and the text messages, everything seems to fit a cycle of abuse. Some of this came to light, but I suspect that the vast majority of incidents were never reported. Maybe only someone in their inner circle like the daughter or very close friends could confirm that long-term pattern. Now, when it comes to domestic violence, you don't always need years of history to detect the danger. But in this specific case, that's exactly what I want to establish for the investigation. If I were running this case, that's what I would hand over to all the lawyers involved. It's vital to understand it through the lens of forensic criminology, to see how this toxic behavior set the rhythm of their relationship. And this includes, but is not limited to, the issue of non-fatal strangulation. When that element shows up in the story, as it does here, alarm bells should ring loud. Because the risk of a victim ending up in a domestic homicide goes up dramatically. They go from moderate risk to an extreme probability of suffering lethal violence, a path that often ends in death. You've taught me to never lose sight of the victim. What do we really know about her? We're breaking down the victimology of this case step by step. When you go through these murky reports, allegations of possible domestic disputes come up. Let's call them that for now. Think about this. They're on a boat far from the safety of home. There's nowhere to go. You're on a small vessel trap. Look at that proximity. What signals do you see? By the way, she was a very good swimmer. According to all reports, she was an experienced swimmer. She knew exactly what to do in the water. Last night I spoke with a friend of hers who described her as an extremely capable and intelligent woman. She handled herself incredibly well at sea. This was told to me by a sailor with years of experience. So what I'm finding out about her unsettles me. Even though she's officially listed as missing for now. What we're hearing about Lynette concerns me a lot. Initially, I would view both of them as potential victims. I would do a complete victimology study on both. The reason is simple. I need to identify who was the predominant aggressor in that relationship. There's an incident from 2015 that serves as an example where she ended up being arrested. But information keeps surfacing that suggests there were other constant confrontations. Listen to what Carlia Worth, Lynette's daughter, says about the relationship between her mother and Brian, her stepfather. I know the past problems between them were serious. That's why this happening now feels so strange. It seems to me that if there was intimate partner violence, it's very likely he was the primary aggressor. But to reach that conclusion, you have to do things right. With scientific rigor. You can't base it on guesses or personal opinions. It's not just what I think. You have to track the facts and measure them coldly to be able to prove it. You have to demonstrate with evidence who is actually the aggressor in this particular relationship. Sometimes in these back-and-forth cases, both parties feed that destructive dynamic. It's not always one-sided. Sometimes the toxicity comes from both sides, and sometimes it doesn't. When you break down the victimology, as I always say, and you've heard me say 1,000 times, the key is usually right there. The victim herself ends up solving the case. And in this scenario, she's an exceptional swimmer. We're talking about a woman who knew the sea, an experienced sailor. There's an angle I think is fundamental to discuss in this process, something that at our firm we call GESQ. It's our own acronym for Geno-Enviro Socioculturalism, a complex term, almost an invention of mine to bring together scattered concepts. In essence, it's about understanding how the physical environment, the social structure, the culture, the lifestyle, the trades, and even the academic background or previous experiences shape the entire personality, the reasoning and the behavioral patterns, along with the emotional baggage of both the person who suffers the crime and the one who commits it in an event of this magnitude. The first thing that jumped out at me was a question: did these people really speak the language of the sea, or was this an isolated incident? Was it just a casual boat ride, or was it their everyday world? Exactly. And this is crucial, because the water was part of their daily lives. When you analyze cases like Michelle McNeil's in Utah, or the murder of Autumn Klein in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and others like them, you notice that the perpetrators were doctors, men who had intimate ties to those women. The mechanics of those deaths have a direct relationship to the technical knowledge, professional training, and experience of those criminals in their everyday work environment. Basically, they use tools from their own environment, familiar elements that they know how to turn into weapons against their romantic partners. They don't have to look very far to come up with a plan, something that seems accidental or logical. That's the mental process when they're trying to decide, how do I get rid of my partner? They're going to fall back on what they know. Look at the case of Harold Henthorne and Tony's murder in the Rocky Mountains. They went hiking, and he simply pushed her off the edge. It's a pattern that repeats over and over. In a large portion of homicides committed by intimate partners, they tend to use something that's part of their GESQ, their socio-cultural reality. In this drama, the weapon was the boat and the ocean. It's what he considers normal, and that's why he tries to minimize suspicion by using an environment that doesn't seem like a threat. He's just taking advantage of the elements of his everyday life. The calls he made to the daughter are disturbing. "Hey, sweetie," he said. "Search and rescue in Hopetown. Just called me. They found the float I threw to Mom when she went overboard. They still haven't found her." The coldness in his voice when speaking to the daughter and to others is telling. For me, everything is fitting together perfectly. The challenge will be the Bahamian police. Their legal framework works very similarly to ours. You can charge someone with homicide without having a body, but the burden of proof is heavy. You have to prove the death. You have to prove who was responsible for taking the life. And if you manage to prove the death and the perpetrator, you still have to determine whether that act constitutes murder. Because homicide isn't synonymous with murder. Homicide is simply when one person dies at the hands of another. It's a technical term. The challenge is elevating it to the category of intentional crime. It's an extremely difficult legal hurdle to cross. Laura, you mentioned the daughter's testimony about that conversation. It's been reported that for Lynette's daughter, this man was her father figure since she was very young. Even on the call, he identifies himself as her father. It's dad, things like that. But from what we've been able to dig out of those conversations, what made you doubt him? It was the chronology, the handling of the timing, and how he tells the events. According to press reports, the event happened at 8:30 at night, but he waited a long time to call her and say, "Your mother has disappeared. We don't know where she is." Something along those lines. She says he started talking about anything and everything and then hung up abruptly. I'm very curious about the way he expresses himself. I'd like to investigate his past more. I think he was a Marine some time ago. We already know he loves to sail, but I need to dig deeper. His idiolect, that unique verbal fingerprint, is vital here. In his very first sentence, there are fascinating psychological clues. I should look up the exact record in the system. Maybe you have it on hand. Yes. Your mother is missing. We don't know where she could be. Exactly, that's what I was referring to. I mean, come on, he's telling his own daughter, "Hey, I have no idea." At least in my case, the way I communicate with my daughter is extremely direct. It all comes down to analyzing his idiolect, his linguistic fingerprint. We'd need to dig into his usual speech pattern to know if she's quoting him verbatim or not. Yes, I get it perfectly. Believe me, I get it. On top of that, you have to consider that the girl is devastated. Her mother is missing and she's furious. But he doesn't even try to present the situation to her as if it were a simple accident. At no point does he go for the typical, "Hi, sweetie, it's Dad. There was a terrible mishap, and we can't find your mom." He doesn't reassure her that they're doing everything possible to find her, or that he'll call as soon as something comes up. That's the human reaction anyone would consider logical. A basic information sequence, where first of all you announce the seriousness of the problem. The normal thing is to inform about the crisis, and then explain what steps you're taking to resolve it, but he simply chose to skip that process. That's why that detail struck me as so disturbing. To be honest with you, Anne, I'm processing all of this as it comes out in the media. A few days ago, I posted a video with my initial impressions and raised a ton of questions about those minutes that just don't add up. I need to understand the logistics of how they got into that dinghy, and above all, what the weather was like at that exact moment. I want to know who got in first, and who got in after. My head was full of doubts. There are just too many gaps in the information. We have so many lost minutes in this timeline. Well, actually, we're talking about hours. And the daughter has already hinted that there was a history of instability and possible episodes of domestic violence between them Allegedly, he made a pretty strange comment early on about Lynette being on a boat. He mentioned something about the possibility of her falling in the water, suffering an injury, or some similar incident at sea. And then the daughter dropped that damning line. And now finally it's happened. He had already floated that idea in a previous conversation, and now it turns out she actually disappears from a boat. Yes, it's terrifying. Almost unbelievable. I've been receiving testimonies from close friends who sailed with them for years, based on what Daniel Danforth told me. I spoke with him just last night. They spent a ton of time sharing trips on the water together. What he told me was that right off the bat the conversation seemed extremely strange to him. But the most incredible thing is that the guy was responding to him on Facebook right in the middle of a massive search operation to find his wife. Daniel was in shock, but his tone was that everything was going to be fine, almost with an out-of-place calm. He said she was probably out there somewhere, and that he had simply been carried off by the current. He insisted it was just a matter of getting back together. Daniel was bothered by how unusually long that conversation was compared to the dry exchanges they always had. All of a sudden, he sent him a huge paragraph packed with unnecessary information. He said to me, "You don't get it. We're two men of the sea. We communicate in short, direct phrases. Things like, yeah, on it, or that's how it went down." Danny thought, "Who is this? What the hell is he talking about?" Exactly. All those details count. Any break from established routine is an immediate red flag. It's clear they're going through a traumatic event, but here it's mandatory to mention the concept of staging or scene setting. Staging is the deliberate manipulation of evidence. And I'm not just referring to the physical traces you find at a location. That would specifically be scene staging, but there's also pre-staging or cyber-staging. It can be digital staging, just like what you mentioned happened on Facebook. Someone could post, "My wife disappeared, please help me," just to create a narrative of concern. According to my own taxonomy, we classify staging into three fundamental categories: linguistic, visual, and gestural. Linguistic staging is exactly what you describe, those conversations that go off script and are completely out of character for the person. The visual would be any alteration of the boat or the physical environment, like strategically placing the safety equipment in the water. That kind of maneuver. And from what I understand, neither of them was wearing a life jacket, is that right? Maybe that wasn't their usual habit. That would be one of the core questions I would raise in the interrogation. Is it normal for them to sail without protection, or are they usually strict about wearing life jackets? Plus, we're talking about an extremely small boat. That vessel is really tiny. Look, this is what's really unsettling. We're talking about a trained Marine. She, on the other hand, is an excellent swimmer, and she just falls backward. It's absurd. I don't know. It occurs to me that maybe she grabbed onto what they call the kill switch that key boats have. You know, she could have tried to grab that cutoff switch just to hold on to something while something was going on in that vessel, with the two of them there, face to face. The point is, if she falls backward, the logical thing is for you to catch her. It's a tiny boat, there's no room for her to be lost. It's a small skiff, almost minimal, and you just grab her. I have too many doubts about this, Laura. I wonder why no one saw anything. It's a heavily trafficked boating area, full of people and vessels everywhere. How is it that no more witnesses have come forward? Why aren't there reports from local people who were right there, watching what was happening? I understand they're keeping the investigation under wraps. They don't want anything to be contaminated that's vital in these cases. If they leak something, it won't be useful in trial later. But the act of boarding that sailboat, of inspecting the main vessel, that's where the key is. I understand they've already executed a search warrant on the sailboat, some kind of technical examination of the vessel, and that's fundamental. Now the dinghy. That's where there could be physical evidence. Although in these maritime scenarios, everything becomes incredibly difficult. A crime scene in the water is chaos. If the boat moves, it's 10 times worse than investigating anything on dry land, basically. On land, things stay in place. Here, how many crime scenes do we actually have? For me, the issue of staging or simulation is going to come up when we analyze the timeline using the war room method. First, we establish the main milestones. They meet in 2005, they get married, all that backstory. We map their lives up to 2026, and then we focus on January. We have to dissect what happened that month. We go back to January using the sub-macro timeline. It's our second timescale of the 7 we work with in total. On that record, we're going to mark the January incident. Those concerns she shared with her friends, the fears she was already carrying. After that, we focus on the 7 days leading up to the main event to see the behavior of both of them. And we get to the 24 hours before. That block of time is what we define as the critical period. It's the timeline of the moment of death. There, the analysis is cold, rigorous. We do it minute by minute. We literally map every minute of those 24 hours up to the precise moment Lynette goes overboard. That's why so many gaps appear in the story, right? Exactly. Our methodology always exposes those missing minutes. Let me tell you something, Laura. There's a fascinating detail a close friend mentioned. There were too many loose pieces in that puzzle. The way they supposedly got separated doesn't make sense. There's a crossover of messages, chats, and calls that don't fit the official version. If you look at the police reports and how he described what happened, you notice the story starts to crack. Then you have the daughter, the stepdaughter. All these versions that differ slightly from one another and raise suspicion. He said this investigation should have started from scratch as a missing person case. Forget his version for a moment. Forget where the dinghy was or what they were doing on that little boat. None of that matters now. I thought it was a really insightful way to approach the problem honestly. He suggested throwing out the entire story he told and starting with a simple premise: find Lynette. She's not here. She disappeared from the moment she left that place in town. That's the reality. There's nothing more. At 7:30 in the evening, she leaves a restaurant, and the next morning he turns up alone. He shows up in the middle of an island in a small boat. That's the only concrete thing we have based on the current information. It's the simulator's playbook. Someone who stages a scene only gives you the information needed for you to buy their lie. If they're trying to sell you a paradise that doesn't exist, they're going to embellish the story with all the details you want to hear. In this scenario, she's a missing person. That should be the focus. But where is his interest really? I never found a record of anyone who saw or boarded that auxiliary boat at that critical moment. Given the geographic environment and the social context of that area, it turns out to be pretty unusual, to say the least. If there was staging, and if the findings end up being consistent with a deliberate criminal act, I'm talking about something dark, like an intimate partner homicide. The most likely thing is that the water is the main scenario. But there's something that bothers me. Why not go back to the sailboat, sail out to open sea, and have her fall in there? It would have been a much simpler and less risky plan, don't you think? I still think it's strange. Why not use the main sailboat, get miles out into the ocean, and stage the accident there? Sure, that would have made things much simpler for someone trying to hide something. It's very suspicious. That's right. But look, I think there are other angles to consider. If you're going to stage your own wife's murder, why would you choose a cove? It doesn't seem like the most obvious place for something like that. That's why one of the questions I raised in my video a few days ago was that were they arguing before everything happened? That would be a strong reason for it to occur in that exact spot. In the end, in these types of cases, every detail always ends up matching the aggressor's needs. The point is that we're analyzing a classic case of intimate partner violence. In that homicidal pattern, nothing is coincidence. Not the time, not the date, much less the chosen location. Everything is designed to serve the perpetrator. If you wonder why the body ended up in that position, the answer is simple: because it suited him. Why did the weapon end up in her hand? Again, because that's what the aggressor needed for his story. You can always answer that question at level 1 of the triage process. It happened that way because it covered the perpetrator's needs. Of course, then you have to dig deeper and ask what those specific needs were. You have to go way beyond the surface. In this scenario, why not just get on the sailboat, head out to sea, and let her fall in the water? If he had done it that way, they would never have been able to find her. I feel like a fundamental piece is missing right before that supposed fall. Something just doesn't fit. I wonder if there was some kind of physical conflict or a violent fight in those final moments. We know they had been dragging problems along, but what hasn't been clarified yet is what he stood to gain from her death. What was the real benefit? Because there's no murder without a motive, without something the perpetrator gets in return. Sometimes the benefit is simply satisfying rage, easing anxiety, protecting a secret, or stopping her from leaving for good. Imagine she tells him, "Take me back to that boat, and the moment we get there, I never want to see you again." He explodes with rage and pushes her. Things like this happen all the time. I'm using the boat example because of the context of this case, of course. But the reality is this happens daily in homes and homicides, driven by gender-based violence. It all happens because the dominant aggressor feels he's losing control over the victim. Isn't that right? So they're forced to do something extreme to keep or regain that control. Are we seeing that pattern here? I don't know. There's no certainty yet. No charges have been filed, and there's no formal judicial process for now. The only thing we can do is analyze it based on the criminal patterns that are already well documented in the literature and in previous cases. At the end of the day, it's not rocket science. Killing is a terribly simple act. Exactly. And that simplicity is what investigators need to come back to. I'm convinced there will be many more conversations with Brian Hooker to try to figure out what really happened to Lynette in those minutes. It's an extremely difficult case to prove. First, you have to legally demonstrate that Lynette is dead. Second, prove that a crime was committed. And third, identify the responsible party by name. It's almost like the scenario of a perfect crime out at sea. You don't have a body, you don't have a clear motive. And you don't even know where she is. It's an absolute mystery. Fortunately, perfect crimes don't exist, although there are murders that are far more twisted and difficult to prove than others. Thank you so much for sharing these reflections with me today. As always, your insights are like lights that go on in my head. They give me ideas about who to talk to and how to get more information. We'll keep talking about this as things move forward. I really hope they find Lynette very soon. One of the couple's friends mentioned something interesting to me, that maybe they shouldn't even be searching in the water. Maybe the key is to look for her on land. There's a possibility her body was buried somewhere. There's also the theory that she escaped by swimming and is hiding from Brian, but at this point she would have already reached out to her mother or her daughter to tell them she's safe. Let's hope she turns up soon, because without a body, it seems this investigation has come to a complete standstill. Tell me what you think about what Dr. Petler observed. We'll keep following the trail of this story. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any detail of what we post here.